Good afternoon. I'm Cadet Thomas, a freshman in the Air Force ROTC program at Miami University of Ohio, and I would just like to start by saying how lucky I feel to be here in the presence of such military greatness. It's truly humbling. Our next speaker is a dedicated combat leader, a Marine who served for 30 years, and at the time of his retirement was the only colonel to have been decorated twice with the Distinguished Service Medal. He completed multiple tours in Vietnam, during which he won multiple awards and honors. His dedication to our country reaches far beyond his career in the Marines, and since his retirement has made more important contributions as a business leader and inspirational speaker. We are blessed to have him with us. Please help me welcome Colonel Anthony Wood.
Let's see, I guess this thing is working. Okay, cadets, on your feet, all of you. Nice to have everybody else here. I'm going to say is going to be aimed at you. Times, no good choice. Happen. An event. Everything I'm about to tell you is true. It all happened. I'll answer any questions you have afterward. Try to pick out what I just talked to you about. Sometimes you have no good options and you still have to execute. Always a question of finding out the one that does. Down, please. I am honored and I am humbled, seriously, to be here. First of all, to be allowed to talk to you and to be here with the speakers that we listened to yesterday and earlier today, especially the Special Operations Forces. I'm going to talk to you about veterans, but it's veterans of another generation. Vietnam, 1974 and 1975, ending with the fall of Saigon. And right at the beginning, let me say that there were many parts of the final evacuation of Saigon. I'm only going to talk about one of them. The 534 helicopter sorties who transported evacuees in the final leg to safety from the DAO compound in Saigon, the largest helicopter airlift in military history. The embassy Marines who were the last to leave the beleaguered city the next morning after the main evacuation. Theirs is another story. And the 100 or so American civilian volunteers, most of whom were 55 to 60 years old, who volunteered to stay and help evacuate thousands of their fellow countrymen in the final evacuation, literally as NVA, North Vietnamese Army, tanks were entering the city. This is their story. It's the story of the civilian volunteers in Saigon, and it's one that deserves to be told. The story begins in the summer of 1974 when I returned to Southeast Asia for the last time. I was 28, a Marine captain, a parachute-qualified infantry officer. I'd volunteered to return, and my job was to direct field operations to resolve the MIA cases. I had a Army Special Forces team of about 50 guys, a deputy who was a huge Army hero, George Petrie, the finest tactical officer I've ever met, and the first man on the ground in the Son Tay raid into North Vietnam. A Navy intelligence detachment and an Air Force medical detachment. It may have been the first joint outfit in combat operations, but who knows? My previous tour was a very different kind of a tour. My first tour, I had an armored platoon, even though I'd never trained on tanks and didn't have a clue really how to employ them. But the Marine Corps can sometimes give you some very strange assignments. So I had an armored platoon with the ROC Marine Corps Blue Dragon Brigade in operations against the North Vietnamese. When I returned, instead of being one among thousands of Marines, I was one of only 6 Marine officers in all of Vietnam. And I had the only operational unit in Vietnam. Think about that for a minute. There were 185,000 Marines when I left the last time, and there were 6 this time. The country was very different in 1974. We'd withdrawn our last fighting forces in 1972, and not even a hospital remained when I arrived in August of 1975. As we withdrew, our last act had been to promise to logistically support our South Vietnamese allies against the continuing North Vietnamese aggression. But after President Nixon's resignation, we broke that promise that we had made to our former allies. The South Vietnam I found in the late summer of 1974 was a new world. NVA divisions remained in sanctuary bases inside South Vietnam, protected by the Paris Peace Treaty. They were immune to air attack, and it wouldn't have made any difference because the South Vietnamese Air Force, VNAF, didn't have the parts for most of their planes anyway, since we had denied them. There wasn't enough gas for the Army's vehicles, and in some areas there was only 1 round per howitzer per day to protect. Amazingly enough, even in the face of this abandonment, they treated me with great honor as an ally. But I got to tell you, it was hard to hold your head up. From August of 1974 until February of 1975, I commanded a small joint force of Army Special Forces and the Navy medics and so forth in MIA operations trying to resolve the over 2,000 MIA cases in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Outside the cities, the level of skirmishes continued around us, and it required that I negotiate with local chieftains for security because, of course, there were no U.S. forces to protect us, and the ARVN forces were the PFs, the popular forces, were unreliable. In November, about on my 29th birthday in the field, I was ordered to move forward to Saigon when the last U.S. Air Force helicopter detachment left NKP and Samisan and went back to the United States, the Jolly Greens. We had been using the Jolly Greens for insertion and extraction for our missions. I went forward to Saigon, and from then on, Air America. How many of you have heard of Air America? Raise your hands. Not many. Air America was a private airline funded by the CIA. Probably the finest helicopter pilots I have ever seen, former Army warrant officers by and large. And from then on, from November until Saigon fell on April the 29th, we operated exclusively our insertions and extractions from the Hueys of Air America. In December of 1974, the North Vietnamese moved out of their sanctuaries to the west and attacked Phuc Long in the highlands. We didn't realize it was a test. And even had we realized it was a test, we still would have flunked it. What it foretold to them was that we wouldn't intervene, there would be no B-52 support, and that we would not honor our promises to help South Vietnam if the North attacked again. That's what it told Giap and the North Vietnamese. It was a dead giveaway on what? On our will to fight, on our will to return, on our will to honor our promises. On March the 9th, the North Vietnamese, not very much later, seized Ban Mi Tu, a key highway intersection in the Central Highlands only 200 miles from South Vietnam. We didn't realize it, but it was day one of the 50 days that South Vietnam had left as a nation. On my return from operations at that date, Major General Homer Smith, an Army Major General, the Defense Attaché. The Defense Attaché is the ranking military officer that the United States has in any country abroad. The Defense Attaché ordered me to report to him. I'd never seen a Major General before, so this was a new experience. I had no idea why I was reporting to the defense attaché, but George Petrie and I reported to the defense attaché, stood at attention, and he said, "Welcome, gentlemen." He was a Virginia boy, and he had a soft accent. "You are now in the special planning group." "Yes, sir." "Sir?" "Yes." "What is the special planning group?" "The special planning group is you." "Yes, sir." "Got it." This is what went down. "Do you have any questions?" I thought, don't say a word, Wood. Just keep your mouth shut. He said, "You are now going to develop a plan to evacuate the capital of South Vietnam, the urban city, and you're going to hook that plan up to the existing plans for evacuation furthermore out of Tan Son Nhut Airport." All we could say was, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Everything is top secret. You will have to clear it with me, and under no circumstances will you tell anything to the embassy or will you go to the U.S. Embassy." Now, that's a very strange order to get when you consider that the ambassador is in charge of everything in any country in the world until it is turned into a military operation, anywhere. That's how the United States is set up. We went down, we found a bunker. Before we knew it, he had MPs at the door guarding it, and we formed the special planning group. This really happened. Our assigned task was to plan for the eventual evacuation of Vietnamese employees, the Americans, and third country nationals for which the U.S. had legal responsibility in Saigon. The United States Department of State, the United States Information Service, USAID, the CIA, DIA, dozens of non-governmental organizations. This is the world you have today as well, except it's even more complex. Nobody knew, absolutely no one knew, how many employees they had, whether or not they had families, and no idea where they lived. It was amazing. March the 13th, 5 days after the SPG was formed, President Thieu ordered the abandonment of the highlands. An entire South Vietnamese corps fell apart in a routing retreat because they were trapped. And it was the beginning of the end in the West. Because Martin had strictly forbidden any overt plans, the ambassador had no overt planning at all for the evacuation. We had to plan in secret. And we operated in a guarded bunker across from Tan Son Nhut Airfield in northwest Saigon. Now let me put this in perspective. We had 4 days as a planning group. We'd been reinforced. One more Marine was added. So there were now 3 of us in the special planning group. Jim Saboteur. When the North Vietnamese had attacked, and we found out that we had to move very swiftly to build a plan. Who had to be evacuated? Didn't know. Where were they living? Didn't know. How many? By what means would they be transported out of the country? We had some notions there because there were 4 old plans that were existing. What plans already existed, and critically, what conditions would we face in Saigon when the evacuation went down? The first task was gathering intelligence. No one really knew much about the huge mission, and unfortunately, listen to this, the situation that pertains today is not very different that you will walk into. Unfortunately, we don't tend to think that we're going to get into those situations, and so the planning tends to stay dusty on the shelves. At any rate, the list went on and on. Using funds that were untraceable, talk about these things now, I bought the records to the Circle Sportif. Expensive. I bought the records to them because almost all the foreign dignitaries in Saigon and their families belonged to the Cercle Sportif. Using funds that were untraceable, that means they came from one of the agencies, I bought a series of rental records to identify who were Americans and others throughout the city. And then I was lucky. Now, no matter what you heard, it is important to be lucky as it is to be skilled. Luck plays a big role. I was in a taxi cab crossing Saigon to someplace, I don't remember, maybe on my way to the embassy because I had permission to go there. And started to get out, the taxi cab driver, now there were about 250 of these black and white Fords in Saigon. And any American that wanted to go anywhere, anytime, all he had to do was call one of these Fords, fill out a chit, it was free, and he would make, and I watched him fill that chit out and put it in a box in the front seat of that car, and I said, those chits? He said, oh yes, we have a warehouse full of them. I said, you're kidding me. You mean every time you pick somebody up, one of those chits is filled out and it's in a warehouse? He said, yeah. Well, it was a warehouse about the size of this room, and there were rows and rows and rows of boxes. Well, believe it or not, I had my own aircraft, one of those Beach King Airs. So I started taking these boxes. I didn't fly them, the pilot did, and flew them to Thailand, where we had the computers that we had used in the search for the POWs. Just, you know, you probably have more computing power in the Apple Watch than we had in our entire building in 1974 or 5. But nonetheless, every one of those boxes for the last year yielded a treasure trove of where people were concentrated in Saigon. And the pin map began, and this map became something that every morning General Smith came down to look at, and the other senior officers who were allowed to come into the bunker. And the pin map showed the concentrations of people all over Saigon as we slowly developed a picture of who we would have to evacuate. So there were some other ways we gathered the intelligence, but the bottom line was we began to get a picture of where people were. On March the 19th, the second shoe fell. The North Vietnamese attacked from the north and took Quang Tri City, signaling that now the offensive was coming both from the north and the west simultaneously against Saigon. The city collapsed, Quang Tri City, amidst rioting, arson, desertion, violent panic, and it set a pattern for all the cities that followed. Thousands and tens of thousands were fleeing south. In the face of the continuing NVA advance, Ambassador Martin began to allow a gradual thinning of the mission. Now get this, it didn't make much difference because it had been 7 years since anyone in Saigon had heard a shot fired. 7 years. Do you think all those comfortable Americans with free taxis and comfortable Europeans in their suites with the French restaurants were going to get up and leave when they couldn't even hear anything? Not a chance. He got very, very little cooperation on the thinning of the mission. But then we got a message from the embassy that we suspected we had to take care of others, but we weren't sure. We had to take care of 13 other nationalities besides the United States. They're called third country nationals, ladies and gentlemen. We have treaty responsibility today for third country nationals all over the world. By late March, despite continuous drawdown, we knew that the mission was at 18 to 20,000 Vietnamese Americans and third country nationals, far more than we could get out in any foreseeable scenario of 8 to 10 hours. I suggested to the SPG that we do a worst case plan, and Jim Saboteur, Major Saboteur, said, what do you mean? I said, look, what if we can't get a plan to get them out? What if the North Vietnamese Army realizes just how fractured South Vietnam is before we can get a plan together? I said, I think we need to build an internment camp and plan for 5,000 to 10,000 Americans in Saigon, surrounded by the North Vietnamese inside an internment camp in the DAO. And that's exactly what we did. But, of course, in the meantime, we had the secret evacuation going for the Phoenix agents and some others, South Vietnamese employees that had to get out of the city. We had a discussion with SINCPAC, and General Smith brought us into his office to discuss how we would gather the evacuees in Saigon. SINCPAC planned to use the giant soccer stadium in the center of the city. George Petrie and I had fallen with 5 cities by the time this discussion occurred. We knew how Saigon would fall. We knew the Chinese in Chosin would not mutiny. We knew the South Vietnamese airborne was riddled and would mutiny. We knew that there would be arson, roadblocks, snipers, and we knew that the cities would have, because Quang Tri fell that way, and eventually Da Nang fell that way. So we countered back and said, we can't defend the soccer stadium. It'll take a Marine regiment, and the last photograph that you see of the evacuation of Saigon will be us shooting innocent civilians to protect the soccer stadium from the rioting. Well, eventually, SINCPAC gave in, and General Smith was able to do it. So we were going to bring everybody to the DAO at Tan Son Nhut, take them across the street where the fixed-wing Air Force transports would pick them up and take them out of the city. We had a plan. But a big question remained: how many people? Now, on March the 26th, the 18th day of the Special Planning Group, we held our first meeting with an expanded group of volunteers that was helping us build the internment camp in secret. Now, try to do that sometime. Try to build a camp for 5,000 to 10,000 people inside this huge DAO compound and flying in everything from baby milk to you name it on Air Force C-141s, unloading them at night, and then trying to build this internment camp. We had 12 to 15 American civilians. It was the beginning of a group that grew to over 120 at its height. These are 55 to 60-year-old people with day jobs, and they work all night because we haven't got anybody else. There are no troops to help do this, and it has to be done in secret, from the ambassador in secret. We explained our plan. We would fortify the compound. That was point 1. We would prepare Project Alamo. We would begin moving the mission slowly and people into 18 selected buildings to the extent we could along the routes of bus convoys. 8 routes. And buses would operate on these 8 routes named after the western trails in the United States: Oregon, Texas, Chisholm, and so forth. Meanwhile, Marine helicopters would land on the roofs in the 16 buildings that we had selected for HLZs. And we had designated those and were working on them. And the idea was the buses operating on the 8 routes would get the bulk of the people, and those that had to be picked up afterward, the rooftop would be picked up by the helicopters. Well, it was a good plan, but you know how plans are. You have to execute them. And we didn't have anybody to man the rooftops, bring in the helicopters. We didn't have any bus drivers. We didn't have any escorts to guide the convoys, plumbers and carpenters to block the stairwells. Why would we want to block the stairwells? Because we knew from the cities we had fallen with that the first thing that would happen when helicopter zones were on the roof is the rioters would try to go up the stairwells and to take the buildings. So Pacific architects and engineers came through, and they built a series of ingenious folding barricades that we quietly installed in the stairwells of the 16 or 18 buildings that we had HLZs on the roof. Volunteers. The volunteer group grew some more. March the 30th. 3 weeks almost to the day since the SPG was formed. Da Nang falls. Da Nang falling is about the same as Chicago falling in the United States. It's the second largest city in Vietnam, and it's the centerpiece of a lot of their mercantile. It was an incredible blow. In Saigon, the national police immediately declared martial law. They erected roadblocks and curfewed the city. Now, of course, the curfews were a huge threat to everything we had planned. So effective on the 20th, one of us went out every night and played chicken with the roadblocks. We had to know where the roadblocks were because they were shifting, because if the balloon went up for the convoys, we had to know whether they could go or not. And needless to say, our weapons were silenced, and I think you can guess why. Tens of thousands of people are pouring south now and coming in from the west into Saigon. Panic is spreading rapidly in the capital. April the 3rd, may be the worst day of my life. The day begins with Vietnamese women throwing their babies over the wire into the compound. Heard about the baby lift, Operation New Life. So the Marines dropped their M16s, and we only had 12 Marines for this whole compound, huge compound, about 1.5 times the size of the Pentagon, and with its parking lots, 12 Marines. They drop their M16s, and they start catching the babies. You may have seen the pictures. You may not know this, cadets. You have a very good moral compass. You will do the right thing, trust me. You have been brought up correctly, and it's amazing to see the American fighting man and what he, or gal, and what they will do. So they did the right thing. They caught the babies. Well, that was only the beginning of a terrible day. The C-5A landed that the government of the United States had ordered flown in. It was the largest transport in the world on April the 3rd. It landed at Tan Son Nhut, and the 300 orphaned infants were loaded on board it. 30 American women, volunteers again, 20 of whom were from the volunteers working with us, boarded the C-5A. It took off, and it had explosive decompression at 2,500 feet over Saigon. The doors blew off, went through the tail. Most of the occupants were sucked out. Then, in an incredible feat of airmanship, the young Air Force captain at the controls, using nothing but engines, because he had no connection to the tail, when he realized he wasn't going to make it back into Tan Son Nhut, which he was close to making. It was amazing he could even turn that plane at all. When I realized he couldn't make it, he got it into a rice paddy. A few of the crew survived because they're in that second-story cockpit. Almost everyone else was killed. Now, as you think about what can happen to you, think about it so far. 3.5 weeks, cadets. This is 3.5 weeks after, or close to that, that the SPG was formed. Normally have months to work on plans, much less having no assets to do it. This is what I was saying to you. You do not always get the choice of how your life is going to go. And I wasn't a whole lot older than you all. I was 29 at this point. So I held a meeting immediately because the impact on the volunteers was huge. These weren't 18, 19, 21-year-old Marines. They were 55 to 60-year-old secretaries. One of them, who had volunteered to be a bus driver, was a lieutenant general equivalent, Bill Austin, the area auditor for Southeast Asia. He volunteered to drive buses. The meeting was in a room about like this. There's about 100 volunteers at this point on April the 3rd. Hear a pin drop. Babies are dead, all except 3, I think. Women are dead. The impact was horrendous. And I said, look, here's the plan in all of its details. There will be no security in Saigon with the convoys. The ambassador has ruled out any Marines operating in the city. We have a plan for the security, but there won't be any armed security with us when we go in. The ambassador has forbidden Marine Corps helicopters to operate on the rooftops. We're going in with Air America doing the rooftops, more volunteers. The ambassador has forbidden any security in the buildings, so we will train our own rooftop controllers. We will try to bluff it out, and I will cover that with you at a later time because I didn't want to open that discussion up. That was the one trick we had up our sleeve, and that was a one-trick pony, the whole thing. I said, and then I stopped talking. And little lady in the front row, tiny little lady, had the question that was on everybody's mind. Hey, we'll get out. And I knew it was coming. It took me a while to answer it. And finally I said, I don't think we all will. Which is, I told them the truth. And that's another point. Tell the truth, especially when the chips are down. I don't think we all will was my answer. Because I couldn't see how we were going to. There had to be so many points at which this plan could fail. But you don't always get the choice about whether you're going to execute or not, especially with the embassy restricting things the way they were. On April the 9th, 6 days later, Jean-Lac fell less than 40 miles from Saigon. And that same day, Brigadier General Bond, the Deputy Defense Attaché in Vietnam, a terrific Air Force officer, just terrific, holding a formal meeting to try to get the resources play in the Defense Attaché office. He was arrested by Marines sent over from the embassy, put on a C-141 and flown to Guam in the middle of evacuation planning. Now, this is not a fairy tale, I'm telling you. This happened. So the Brigadier General who's in charge of pulling the DAO together and General Smith's assistant is arrested and deported after almost every asset that we needed for the evacuation has been denied. The Air America pilots, 26 of them, all volunteer to join the community. And at this point, I hold another meeting after General Bonds, and I said, we have 40 Fords secretly hidden in a warehouse. One of them has been painted in National Police colors, and a blue circling light has been placed on the roof. You can see where they have blinds in all the windows, so you can't clearly see. And the occupants have National Police helmets and National Police utilities that they will wear. Now, everybody in the city of Saigon was scared to death of the National Police. So, the only way that I thought we might buy time was to put a National Police car at the front and the back of every stick of buses. Every 4 or 5 buses would have 2 National Police cars escorting it. And I thought we might get one or two circuits of buses through before we had to start evacuating entirely from the roof. But we had to prepare the buses. So we had guys that every night were bolting flak jackets. They were terrible, but it's all we had for body armor in those days. They were bolting flak jackets below the windows on the insides of the buses because we knew they'd be shot up. We'd fallen with 5 cities. We'd been there. We'd seen what was going to happen. Then we had to have locations and stages. We had to train the drivers. They got to drive forward 1 foot forward, 1 foot back at night with the lights off, and that was it. That's the training to go into a collapsing city and to run the barricades. The building had to be prepared. Guides had to do their training. And of course, we had to get our communications, so we drained the water tower and we strung wire inside the water tower. The Marines secretly flew in a lieutenant colonel who was brilliant from the brigade offshore in communications. With his instruction, we created a water tower, Lieutenant Colonel Duffy, inside we created an antenna inside the water tower, and then we took all those little crummy Motorola radios that you sometimes see in taxis and equipped all the buses with them. That was the communications network for the evacuation of the city. April the 25th. Everything is nearly complete. 15 NVA divisions are surrounding the city. 30,000 ARVN soldiers are loose, but they have no leadership, and they're inside the city, but they're without units and without direction. Rockets are falling. 40 Marines finally get to come in to be security for the compound. But how do you think we got them from 25 miles at sea? Smuggle them in at night. So they all came in civilian clothes, and their combat gear came in other Air America helicopters. And I have to tell you, the Navy was not thrilled when those Air America helicopters landed at night on those carrier decks to pick up these guys. But we got a platoon of Marines in, which were a big help in the end, as it turned out. The stairwells were fortified, the antenna was working, the fake police cars were ready to go, the buses were staged, and finally, in the morning of the 28th, major 122 rockets all over Tonsonut. Several of them hit the DAO compound, and finally, one of them hit the main gate and killed our Marine sentries, took out the gate and the gate positions, and of course, by the time the barrage ended, 150 rockets later, the aircraft were burning, and there would be no fixed-wing evacuation from Tonsonut, which of course was the plan. So, General Carey orders the helicopters to begin, and all of the Air Force and Marine Corps helicopters that are available to the brigade begin operations, and at 1500 that afternoon, the first of 534 missions lands at the DAO compound. 534 missions went from 1500 in the afternoon till 2400 that evening, when the Marines stopped flying at midnight. No crew rest, none of that nonsense. They flew until they got everybody out of the DAO compound, all the Vietnamese and everyone else. Air America had their fuelers and their station blown up by about noon, and so they started refueling on the highway in the open during the barrage, and flew out to the Navy ships and demanded fuel out there to keep flying, because the Marines didn't start flying until later. Air America flew from 8 until 2100 that night, brought about 1,400 people off the rooftops. Meanwhile, the buses made 5 complete circuits on 8 routes with the fake National Police cars. Remember what I said about luck? How would you like to have ordered those buses into Saigon to pick up those people with zero reaction force and no security? At any rate, we got away with it. We were incredibly lucky, but we got away with it. But it was the worst decision I have ever had to make. And of course, I didn't have the choice of various ways. My job was to plan, and then I was told to execute. And that's what you'll do. You'll plan, and then you'll execute, if that's what you're told to do. So what are the lessons? Well, it was a personal journey in understanding a generation. They were veterans. Most of them were veterans. But they were a lot older than I was. Not all veterans are young. Not all veterans wear uniforms. 30 of them altogether were dead, and several more were injured. The rest went home to small towns and cities all across the country, and we closed the book on Vietnam. And you know what the incredible point is to this whole tale? Despite the fact that we nominated every one of them for the highest award that the Congress can give, not one of them ever received so much as a thank you note. Not one. That's not the most important point. The most important point is not one of them ever contacted me and requested it. Sometimes you do what you have to do because thank you for listening.
Are pretty far behind.
We're pressed for time, but we'll take a couple of questions. I usually have a few.
Questions?
Nothing is off the table.
Oh, okay. Anybody else?
So, after going through all of these, bumps in the road, all these plans there.
First time I've ever heard North Vietnamese divisions referred to bumps in the road. Way to go.
So, with all these bumps in the road, having to correct the course, how'd you keep a good state of mind the whole time?
Tell you, you don't have time. I'll tell you honestly, once we had to start running the roadblocks at night, playing chicken, more than once, I had a cigarette and a glass of scotch for breakfast. I did. Now, I stopped smoking 30, 35 years ago, but nonetheless, well, sometimes we just didn't go to sleep. But you don't have time to worry about your state of mind. Worry at all, you worry about resources and how you're going to, skunk the embassy to get past, about how you're going to secure the safety action forces. There isn't time to worry about it. There won't be for you. Do the right thing because you're trained to do the right thing.
Question here in the red shirt.
Sir.
My name is Bruce McKenty. I'm a retired Army officer, and I was in Vietnam up until March 28, 1973, and I was a helicopter pilot. And I read the book, The Last Men Out, about the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy a few years ago. And it always referred to the DAO and the evacuation from Tan Son Nhut, but it never went into any detail. And I want to tell you what, I thank you for everything you did to help those people, because I was there, and when I left, we couldn't do anything to help those people. And what an incredible story. Thank you for sharing it with us.
One more part. One comment that the embassy was a separate affair. The reason for it was the ambassador wouldn't allow us to include them in the plan. Flooded and surrounded and everything. Got them out the next morning.
Sir.
In order to do, I'll cover this very quickly, but I'm glad you asked the question, because you may, almost certainly in my view, you will face a similar situation. Probably not as completely fairy tale as what happened in Saigon, but close. First, the State Department has a responsibility to be able to coordinate who's there and how many in the whole mission are there. That intelligence was critical, and we never really knew. Operating, as you might have guessed, two captains trying to evacuate a city of several million. Yes, and by golly thing. The first responsibility is State Department. The second responsibility is on hand, especially now, that can move very quickly in, and the intelligence has to be up to speed on the site. Does that answer some of your questions? And it has to be brought, one of the comments that the soft guys made, and it was critical, Intelligence and operations are like this. You have to update all of them all the time. Every time you carry out an operation, you update.
Thank you all very much.
Okay.
Colonel, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. More than you'll ever know. We all have our stories. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to prepare for our what will be our, I suspect, our last panel for the day. Just a couple of minutes, as they say. The mind can only accept what the butt can bear. But you want to just take a quick breather, make get underway in just